Welcome to this week's Parsha class. This week's Parsha is Parshat Vayera. A lot of really exciting things happen in this week's Parsha, or sort of monumental things. This is the Parsha that we read from twice on Rosh Hashanah. We read about Hagar being sent away with Yishmael, and then we read about the Akedah story, both of which are really interesting stories with like a lot of meat to dig into. But I decided to sort of look right before that and to dig into the Midrash. I think that sometimes it's easy to get distracted by the big stories. And so this is an opportunity for us to look at some other piece of the Parsha tonight. Hello, Sarah, welcome. So I'm going to share my screen in case you don't have the source sheet up in front of you. And so again, I can't see everybody anymore, so please feel free to come off mute and just speak up if you'd like, or if you chat, I'll get a little ping, but I might not see like if you wave at me. So I want to look at the beginning of the Parsha at this one little word and sort of try to figure out what it means and what it means about Midrash. That's what I think is the more interesting question. Like, what role does Midrash play in shaping our understanding of the characters in Tanakh and also the things that happen? My father used to get very upset when I would come home from school and say, Esav was really bad. And he said, why? Like, how do you know? Show me in the text. He'd like pull out the Chumash and say, where does it say, you know, whatever thing I was spouting from the Midrash. And I was just telling someone recently, I was complaining, and a woman at my children's school said when she teaches Midrash and Chumash, she puts on sunglasses, like without the shades in. And when she switches to Midrash, she puts her sunglasses down. And it's like this cue that she's going out of the text and into the Midrash, right? Because the Midrash so powerfully shapes the way we think about the characters and the things that happen within the Chumash. So I think that just unpacking this one little word really will hopefully give us a lot of insight as to how the Midrash works and maybe some of their motivations and what, you know, how many grains of salt we should take a Midrash with. So the Pasukim in context here are from Breshit Kaf Aleph. And it says, Vayera Sarah et ben Hagar HaMitzrit asher yelda la'Avraham mitzachik. And that is the word in question. So Sarah sees the son of Hagar, the Egyptian woman, that had birthed Ishmael, that had born, right, that had been sort of an awkward phrasing, but that had birthed Yishmael to Abraham. And what was he doing? He was mitzachik, which is translated here as playing around, which we're not really entirely sure what that means. And how does Sarah react, right? It sounds sort of like maybe, right? I have a baby and a 9-year-old. Maybe he was playing with him, right? Entertaining him, sort of holding something shiny in front of his face. But we know that that's not true because of the reaction that Sarah has. So Sarah says, "V'tomer la'Avraham garesh ha'ama hazot ve'et bana." Cast out that slave woman and her son. Ki lo yirash ben ha'ama hazot im b'ni im yitzchak. Because that son of that slave woman will not share in the inheritance with my son Isaac, right? And this is what leads to this bigger dramatic story about Hagar and Ishmael sort of wandering in the desert, lost, and then parched without any source of water, and Hagar crying out to Hashem, and an angel coming and providing water. Right, but this is the precursor to that. So Yishmael is mitzachik, which is it's something bad based on the reaction that Sarah has. So what I did is I brought a few different translations. There are many, many more. I tried to pick one from like each category, maybe is the way to think about it. So the first thing, right, I think is to look at maybe like the most pshat level, the most basic interpretation, which is the Ibn Ezra amongst others, right? He says Ishmael was just acting as a boy, right? Almost maybe like boys will be boys. Kichein minhag kol na'ar. right? This is just how boys act. He was just playing around. But v'tikna bo ba'avor haito gadol mibna, that Sarah was jealous because he was older than her son, right? Maybe Yishmael was like a good boy who was just playing around, but Sarah was just waiting for the opportunity to cast him out because she wanted the child who inherited from Abraham to be hers, right? It's Abraham who gets the promise of children, not Sarah. And so I think, I don't love the Ibn Ezra, I'll be honest. I'd love to hear other people's reactions. And I think it's because I feel very defensive of Sarah. The Ibn Ezra is making her out to be like this hysterical woman, right? Who is just overreacting at anything that her this other boy, not even her stepson, right, Ishmael, is doing, because she wants something for her child that maybe he doesn't deserve or he can't have, right? It's sort of unclear. So that's like sort of one genre is, look, Sarah, calm down, right? The response is not fitting of the crime. We assumed Mitzachik was bad because Sarah says you have to cast out Yishmael, but maybe Sarah was overreacting, right? So it's one read. As I said, it's not my favorite. Maybe it will be yours, and that's okay. Definitely, I'm open to defenses of the Ibn Ezra. The Sforno makes a claim that is interesting, and it references my favorite, most crazy midrash that I did not know until like 5 or 6 years ago. So I had to put it in here. The Sforno says that he's making fun of the party that Abraham had given to mark the weaning of Yitzchak, right? So in the text, we're told that when Yitzchak is weaned, like when he is reached some level of maturity, Abraham has a very big party for all of the important people of the land as a celebration of marking that moment. And Rashi at that moment says, who were the big people in the land? One of them was Avimelech. Avimelech is the king who takes Sarah, right? Abraham and Sarah go down to Egypt, and Avimelech takes Sarah captive because he thinks that she's Abraham's sister, right? Abraham says that. And then Sarah is returned, right? Avimelech sort of becomes a friend. God intervenes, Sarah is returned. And everything is fine. But what Rashi says is that because of that moment, there was an assumption that Avimelech was the father of Yitzchak. Right? So it sounds wild, but then if you stop and think about it for a minute, right? Here's a couple who struggles with infertility, Abraham and Sarah together. Sarah goes into someone else's home under this circumstance that she's beautiful and the king wants her, right? Presumably there is some kind of wanted or probably unwanted advance, right, that night. And so of course, miraculously, she is pregnant the next, time her, the next month rolls around. Of course it was Avimelech, the younger king who maybe didn't have infertility struggles like Abraham, right? I think it might be sort of the logical conclusion if you think about it. And so it shocks me that I didn't think about it and that, I didn't even know people were thinking about it until so late in my life. But that is this assumption. And so the Sforno is playing, right? He lives in the world of this midrash, right? So already this is total midrash. It's the hypotheses of the rabbis, but the Sforno lives in the world in which that hypothesis is being taken as potential truth. Right? Not necessarily that Avimelech is the father, but that there was that suspicion. And so what does the Sforno says? Oh, he says, Mitzachik, he's making fun of Yitzchak, that he is the child of Avimelech, not of Abraham. He heard this rumor circulating at the party that Avimelech comes to, and he says like, you only were born because the king took your mom into his palace for the night. And there, I think, at the very least, Sarah, there's a little bit more maybe sympathy to Sarah's response, right? Here is already this very complicated family life in their home where there is such tension between Sarah and her old servant Hagar, who maybe seems higher in his eyes. There's already this feeling of her not being worthy of having the child who will be the perpetuator of the inheritance of Abraham. And this is like a smack in the face to all of that insecurity, right? It's confirming that she's not worthy of having that child, that Ishmael is the only real progeny of Abraham. So a different take, I love that it sort of plays into the world. I can't remember what the word is, but like fan fiction, I think, right? When people write stories, like further stories about characters in novels, right? Sometimes they seem to sort of leave the world of the novel behind, but sometimes they really work into right? There's this elaborate backstory and the fan fiction plays off each other. So if you think of the Midrash like as fan fiction, Sforno is playing off of another pre-established Midrashic truth. Which is this claim that Avimelech might have been the father of Yitzchak. Okay, so those are two different directions that you could possibly go in. Then the Tosefta and Sota brings another 4 explanations. So I want us to look at them, but also really be wary of what the Midrash is doing or choosing not to do. So here in the Tosefta, any thoughts before I plow on? So yeah, please go ahead.
Oh, I lost her.
Oh, I can hear you, Anna. Can you hear me?
Yeah, but I don't see you.
Oh,
I don't know. I lost your picture. I'm trying to get back on. Oh my gosh. I lost the video. I don't know what happened.
I wish that I was comfortable enough with Zoom to be able to help you.
You know what? I'm gonna go back and try again. I'll come back.
Okay.
Thank you.
So the Tosefta starts with Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. He's going to be the person who colors the way we think about this midrash. And he says, he's talking about places where he has a machloket with Rabbi Akiva, where he ends up not being convinced by Rabbi Akiva's argument. And what he says, there are 4 places like that. And one of them is the interpretation of this word mitzachek. Right? So this is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai telling us other people's opinions. So he gives 3 different opinions that I want us to look at. The first is Rabbi Akiva, right? And Rabbi Akiva says, Ein tzchok ha'omer kan ela avodat kochavim. Right? Rabbi Akiva says playing around means that Ishmael was worshiping idols. And his proof text, right, is he brings a pasuk from Shemot. This is from Shemot Lamed Aleph, which is the golden calf incident. And so the people make the golden calf, right? They collect all the gold, and Aaron shapes it into a calf, and then it says that the people sit down to eat and drink. Ve'yakumu litzachek. And so because that word appears in the context of Avodah Zarah, Rabbi Akiva says that's what Ishmael was doing here, which is a pretty bad thing, right? That seems bad. That seems worthy of Sarah sort of freaking out and saying, this guy can't live in my house. I don't want Yitzchak to see Avodah Zarah. Rabbi Yossi Haglili disagrees. He says, no. Ein tzchok ha'omer kan, ela gilui arayot. No. It's some kind of sexual perversion. And what does he bring? He brings a pasuk from the end of Breshit, Lamed Tet. This is from the story of Yosef and Potiphar, and Potiphar's wife, right? So Yosef has been sold by the brothers to the Midianites, or taken by the Midianites and sold down to Egypt. And he's working as a servant in Potiphar's home, right? And Potiphar's wife makes a sexual advance on him. And remember, he runs away, and in her sort of embarrassment or cover-up story, she says, oh, the Eved came, letzachek bi, right? Yosef came to play with me, fool around with me. And so therefore it must be some kind of sort of illicit relationship, sexual advancement. So 2 different possible interpretations. And then Rabbi Yishmael says, no. No, it's murder, right? We only say litzachek when we're talking about spilling blood. Now, this is where we see the midrash, I would say, like start to go off the rails, right? Because the first 2 examples maybe they're crazy, maybe they're not crazy, but they use the word letzachik. But in Rabbi Yishmael's pasuk, the word is vayischaku, not vayitzchaku, right? So this one is talking about soldiers who are coming to sort of spar and like play fight, and then they end up dying. So it's not a great example because it's sort of a homonym, not an actual example of the same word. And I think it is super interesting to note that it's Rabbi Yishmael here, right? This is maybe, right, this is not a real, there is a real Rabbi Yishmael, but maybe the Midrash is talking about Yishmael because this is his namesake, Yishmael. Often the rabbis' names have sort of like a play on whatever theme they're bringing up. So these three examples are very serious sins being leveraged, right? Idolatry, gilui arayot, sexual perversion, and murder. Does anyone know what those three crimes have in common besides this midrash? They are referenced in the Gemara and Masechet Sanhedrin. They're the three cardinal sins for which we should die instead of do them, right? So if someone said to me, "You have to murder the person standing next to you, or I will kill you," the Gemara in Sanhedrin says you should allow yourself to be killed. If they say you have to eat a cheeseburger, or I will kill you, you should eat the cheeseburger, right? So basically, I think that what the Midrash is saying here is these are the worst possible things a person could do. Yishmael represents, right, doing the crimes for which we say Yahareg v'al ya'avor, that you should be killed rather than do them yourself. And so it's in some ways, it's almost like a code. It's just saying Yishmael is the worst possible guy. And they use very serious knowledge of text to get there, right? But Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is not happy with this idea. What he says here is, but he says, right, I say, Chas v'shalom sheyeh b'veito shel oto tzadik hahu kach. Right, which to me, again, was like a surprise. The Midrash is always surprising to me. He says, God forbid that there be in the house of this righteous man anyone doing these things. So first of all, right, this takes Sarah out of the equation a little bit, right? But Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, wait a second, you're telling me someone was practicing idolatry, molesting small children, or murdering people in Avraham Avinu's house? Like, that just doesn't seem possible to him, right? What kind of household is Avraham Avinu running that those are the kinds of sins going on? So like the first one of Sarah overreacting, the second one of him sort of speaking not nicely, embracing stories that don't reflect well on the people of the home, that sort of makes sense, right? I'm sure Abraham's tent is a big tent, right? Anyone who's been to like Bedouin tents in Israel, it's not like the one that my family goes camping in the summer, right? A lot of people in the household, Abraham certainly didn't have like I would imagine, didn't have his thumb on everything that was going on in the house, but those things, maybe slip by. But to say that those three cardinal sins would have been happening in his home and he wouldn't have known, and by his own son, seems like too far for Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And I think that more what he's saying there, by saying it so strongly, by saying like chas v'shalom, is like, guys, it's too far. Right, your interpretation, your midrashic interpretation has passed the limit of like what is reasonable to color the story here. It's not right. Right, and it reminds me of my dad saying, like, where does it say that this guy was so bad or this guy was so good? Or right, we allow the midrash so much control in our understanding of the story. When I was in high school, I applied to go to what was then a new school called the Gann Academy in Boston, where Bobby is now. And it's a community day school. I was coming from the Orthodox model of Maimonides middle and high school, or elementary, middle, and high school. And in the sample class that I went to, they didn't use Rashi to learn Chumash. And I was shocked in my sort of very strong Orthodox bubble. I said, how can you understand Chumash without Rashi? And they said, well, that's sort of the point, right? Is that we want the students to understand Chumash on its sort of its textual level. And we are so distracted by Rashi, right? And then when I got to college, like they said, we're so distracted by Rashi, who was so distracted by Christian influence, right? To think that like the sin of being cast out of Gan Eden is so strongly colored by that idea of original sin, which is actually not even a Jewish idea, right? That there are so many sort of layers to how Midrash and then our medieval commentaries function and the societies in which they functioned, and that the fact that they're all men, right? And we allow them so much control and so much power in how we think about and understand the story. And so Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is a product of all of those things, but I think that he is sort of putting the brakes on for a second. And he's saying, understanding that the word mitzachek means that he was an idolater is just a little bit too far. Maybe the same for Gilui Ariyot, but understanding that it's murder, like now we're using a different word in our proof texts, it doesn't really make sense. It's not really the same thing, right? It has to be something different. We cannot call Yishmael a murderer based on this word litzachik. So what does he say? He says, and I don't see Ron Weiner or Weiner, I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name here, but he wrote this to me beforehand, and I agree with him. He said it just means it has to do with the inheritance, and I agree. As says Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, right? He says it's about the Yerusha, right? Yishmael was fooling around and saying, I am the eldest, and so I will take the double portion, right? The eldest son in Tanakh times always gets the double Yerusha, but more than that, and I think what drives Sarah's fear in a lot of ways is that whoever is Abraham's sort of double portion child will be the one who inherits the whole promise of the land and the nation that comes out of him, and the people as numerous as the sands and the stars. And so, and I will say that in this, this is sort of a gentle imagination of what Yishmael had said. In Breshit Rabbah, it says, fools! Exclamation point, I am the eldest, right? He's not very nice about it. And he says at the end, right? And I prefer my words to the words of Rabbi Akiva. Right, I think that, right, and he's only, in that case, referencing back up to this idea of idolatry, of avodah zarah, but he says, I prefer my way. And I think that what is powerful about that is that it does actually fit the text very well, right? If we say, oh, Sarah saw the son that Hagar had with Abraham, making reference to the inheritance being hers, she says, we'll cast him out because he won't share the inheritance with my son, right? It's like a consequence fits the crime kind of response. She's not worried about the inheritance because she's jealous. She's not worried about the inheritance because that's just like the easiest way to get rid of Yishmael. She's worried about it because that's what Yishmael is talking about when he's mitzachik. So that's one piece of what's nice about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's answer. The other, which I've heard from a few different sources, is that saying he's mitzachik is almost like saying he's Isaac-ing, right? He's Yitzchak-ing. He's trying to take the place of Yitzchak in the family. And I think that sort of like dressing up as the other brother, right, comes back to haunt Yitzchak with Yaakov and Esav, where right, what does Yaakov do to get Esav's bracha? Is he puts on the clothes of Esav and the furry blankets to be the skin of Esav. He's Esaving, right? And so here, Yishmael is Yitzchaking, whatever that means, right? We don't really know what it means in the case of Yitzchak. And that's the problem, right? So it's like kind of a fun word play. And it fits the response of Sarah better. And so personally, I think that is probably a very good fit for what mitzachik means, playing around, is that he was trying to edge Yitzchak out of the inheritance of the covenantal bracha that Abraham got. But I love the intertextuality of the Sforno, but I love the idea of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai that we have to be very careful with our midrashic understandings, both in understanding them, understanding that they are in fact midrashic interpretation and not necessarily pshat, and also making sure that we don't stretch too far. Maybe another week in this class, I'm very influenced by a beautiful book called Yershuni, which is it's edited and compiled by Tamar Biala, who's a scholar in Israel, and it's a group of what she calls women's midrashim. She argues that midrash, although that really does sort of reference a time period, right? It's like saying medieval, that had women been able to write midrash at that time, that they would have written similar midrashim. And so these are midrashim explored by women. So they often, they flesh out the character of Sarah instead of Abraham, or, right? So there's a whole beautiful chapter on the Akedah. It's a little bit edgy, so I didn't bring it today. Right, but I think that right, we can allow midrash to take us in all different kinds of directions, and so we just have to remember, right? People have an easy time telling Tamar Biala, "Oh, what you're doing is telling a story," right? But that's what Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yossi Aglili are doing too. They're doing it at a time where it was more accepted, and they've entered the canon, and they have, a lot of an amazing grasp on the canon, right, to be able to reference. Right, without Sepharia, Shemot Lamed Aleph as another place where the word litzachek comes up. But again, it's still just a perspective and a point of view. And so I think that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's words resonate for me. And also to think that kind of behavior, I hope, wasn't happening in Abraham's tent, and that it just fits in better textually there. Anna asks a good question. How old was Yishmael at this time? And I've seen widely varying understandings, right? Some people think Yitzchak is a baby and Yishmael is like a preteen. Some people said he was older, closer to, it ties into the question of how old Yitzchak is at the Akedah, which also is sort of an unknown. The time of Tanakh is, assuming it's even linear, right? Following that in Mu'char Mukdam B'Torah, not following that, thinking there is sort of a chronological order. It's still not clear how many years have passed, but people like Rashi believe that actually there isn't necessarily a chronological order at all. And so then you're sort of left trying to figure out the pieces of a timeline. So I don't know. Why do you ask, Anna? I'm curious.
Because the first opinion said that Ishmael thought that, remember,
Acting as a boy is wont to act. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and he was thinking that, let me see, that first opinion was about the fact that, I can't recall, but I just wanted to know that, it was about that sexual encounter with Sarah possibly, and how could a boy, how old was he? Why would he think that?
That's a good question. I think you're right? I think that again, right, because it's not shot, right, the different midrashim are influenced by their understanding of how old he is, right? So the Ibn Ezra, who says boys will be boys, is probably thinking of Yishmael, I would assume, as a younger child. Whereas I think you're right, for the Sforno's read to make sense, he'd either have to be an exceptionally perceptive child, but more likely he's a teenager or maybe even a little older. And when you think about the idolatry, so Breshit Rabbah brings this crazy idea that he's sacrificing grasshoppers on a mizbeach, which is kind of a wild idea. And one of the things that I think makes it sort of wild is like, I picture, they say like, right, like what do psychopaths do, right? They torture animals. Like if you watch those like Law and Order type shows, right? And you see those like little boys doing terrible things, or in Toy Story even. I don't know if anyone Toy Story fan here. I think his name is Sid. My kids watch that movie a lot, right? Like he sort of splices all the dolls in this cruel way. So that makes me think of Ishmael, even though it's idolatry, avodah zarah, which makes him seem sort of, maybe it's like a grown-up crime. The way Breshit Rabbah understands it is it's like a child's play of avodah zarah. But yes, I think that you're right, that the age would definitely inform the thinking of what the crime is. And because we don't know, it allows everyone to sort of, as I like, go off the rails in whatever direction they want to. But yeah, it's a good question about consistency. I don't know if there's another place where the age comes up, right? You would expect even Ezra to assume he was younger then, he's older later. Right. Certainly when we think about Hagar and Ishmael in the desert, I think I always thought of him as more on the end of the childhood spectrum than the teenage spectrum, right? Hagar sort of puts him under a bush and walks away. It does seem like there's I don't know, a difference. Hello, Nelson. It's nice to see. Well, you're muted. Oh, there you go.
Sorry, I'm late.
That's okay. That's okay. We were wrapping up a little bit. But I'm sorry that we missed you. We were discussing what age Ishmael might have been at the time of this incident of being cast out from Abraham's tents. And we had talked a little bit about sort of the power of Midrash and also maybe when we should put limits on Midrash. Because the Midrash says, Ishmael might have been an idolater or a murderer or someone who practiced Gilui Arayot, maybe like he molested Yitzchak or something terrible. And how Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says like, no, that's too much. It's too far. That wouldn't have happened in Abraham's tent. It must just be about the inheritance. And so I think Anna was fairly saying, well, if he was 9, we might have expected different crimes than were he 15, or however we think about how old he was. And I was saying, I thought of him as like a child in the story that we read on Rosh Hashanah. So I don't know.
Thank you.
Sure. And maybe the other sort of contextual piece, right, is that at the end of the day, God saves Ishmael in the Midbar, and he makes a great nation out of him too, not the same as Abraham, right? And so you've got to wonder if he'd done one of those really bad things. I wonder if he would actually be given all those blessings by Hashem. I don't know.
Hi, Yael. Hi, Rabbi Yael.
Hello.
I'm Kathy. I just wanted to make a short comment. I'm sorry I joined late.
Sure.
How interesting it is that the person voting for what I consider a more normal sense of human behavior and motivations is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who is not known for having normal reactions to normal human emotional stuff. But he's the one who says, you can't just assume that everybody who has a late son, a class clown in the house at that boy age, that they're all just evil people out to destroy you. This is just about Yerusha, money. We all know, everybody fights over that. So thank you for that. I love that.
That's beautiful.
So interesting that it was him that said that.
Yeah, that's great, Kathy. That's a really astute point. I love it, right? Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is the one who's trapped in the cave, and when he comes out, he sets the world on fire with his eyes, right? So certainly he is an extreme reactor, and it's true. There's maybe sort of a funny, maybe almost an irony to saying he's the one to pump the brakes here and say like, let's not overreact. Yeah, I like that. That's great.
Thank you. Thank you. Keep teaching. I loved it. Even if I only got 5 minutes, it was a good one.
Thank you. Yes, I imagine that it's, I imagine 8 p.m. is always a hard time, and especially on election day, perhaps people got delayed. And the goal is will be between, 30 to 45 minutes, I think, most weeks. And certainly they don't build on each other in a way that would, preclude you from coming to one later or also to jumping in whenever you're here. Yeah, that's great.
Excuse me, I had heard that Sarah wanted Hagar to leave because Ishmael was teaching Yitzhak bad things. There's a bad influence on him. Is that true?
So I love that question, right? In the context of thinking about Midrash, because I think that we all want to know, is that true about whatever thing we're learning in Tanakh? And the Torah is extraordinarily terse. And so we're left having to wonder. And the Midrash is so tantalizing because it offers us the answer to that question, right? Is that true? I love the way you phrased it, Anna. I think that the Midrash you are citing comes from this Avodah Zarah Midrash. That Yishmael was teaching Yitzchak to worship idols or to do sort of bad things in terms of theology. And in that way, right, that is a Midrash that is, we like, I think in part because it reflects very well on Sarah, right? Sarah is not being jealous like the Ibn Ezra sort of alludes to. She's actually protecting like the purity of her home, unlike Abraham, whose head is not in the day-to-day game in his home. She is the one who's making sure that the tent stays pure, right? So when Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, Chas v'shalom, that should happen in Abraham's tent, really, he should be saying, wow, like that didn't happen in Sarah's tent, right? Sarah was the one who sort of guarded against that thing. And I think that that's the bad behavior being alluded to, but of course it could be any of the others too, right? I think often we think of the mitzacheking as being against Yitzchak, but it could be that he was, Yitzchak was learning bad behavior in terms of violence or in terms of, sexual, being sexually predatory from Yishmael also. So any of those three, I think, are the bad behaviors that get referenced.
Okay.
As to whether it's true, I don't know. I think if you go with Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, then you might say, no, it's not true, right? That actually, and again, that's what I sort of like about the idea of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is that Yishmael is not such a bad person. He's a person, right? He's a person who wanted to be the oldest son because he is in fact the oldest son, right? He wants his place in the family to be validated. That's sort of the backstory that I see on Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. He's saying, look, I'm the oldest. I'm going to receive the inheritance because that is in fact true in that time period. And it's then that Sarah realizes she has to interfere, right? And I think sometimes, again, if we look at the next iteration of this, when Yaakov and Esav are fighting for the inheritance, some people see Rivka as the savior, right? When she proposes this sort of tricky plan where Yaakov sort of impersonates Esav. And some people say, no, she meddled too much. That was very deceitful, right? She taught Yaakov that it was okay to lie and to be deceitful. So too, I think you could say the same about Sarah, right? Sarah protects the purity of the family line, of the covenantal family line. Or maybe Sarah is actually meddling in a place that's not her business. Maybe she should have trusted Abraham to recognize the rightful heir. Or maybe, I think we assume Sarah is right, that she had God's bracha because it all plays out the way she wants it to. So let's assume that it was true. She might not have had to meddle, I guess is what I'm saying. And so I think that Yishmael comes across in the most sort of real and neutral light under that explanation.
Can I give one explanation?
Please.
My own? And I have no references to justify my sources, but I'm feeling like the friends of Joe trying to tell him, you must have done something wrong. It must be a reason for God to punish you. Maybe we just can't fathom what went on. Maybe we just have to accept the uncertainty, the lack of knowledge. That God has plans. It's not up to us we make guess like we are doing, like all the rabbis have done. But the final answer, is there one? I don't think that's what was I have to express that.
Yeah, I think that's so important to remember, right? Is that I think you're right that we like to search for meaning, right? And so mitzachek is appropriately vague, and so we can try to color it however we want to make ourselves feel good. So it makes me feel better to say Yishmael is a neutral character, right? It made the rabbis feel better to say he was a terrible character. But we don't know, right? And we can only, again, we can only fill in backwards. So I think that if God had not confirmed Sarah's command of Abraham to cast out Ishmael, and if God had not seemingly sort of agreed that the behavior was bad, the rabbis might have done something different. But again, if you go even a little further, then it is sort of shocking that Ishmael gets such brachot if he were an idolater or a child molester, right? So it could go either way. And I think that you're right, that there are sort of deep desires to make meaning that drive the midrash. Definitely.
Do we have one more minute?
Yeah, sure.
So even today in our time, I have trouble knowing how much to value and how much to abhor modern comedy, which can sometimes be very mean and very cutting and very insightful and very mean and very cutting all at the same time, and sometimes very abhorrent. And I don't think that we're necessarily so much more sophisticated. I think these were issues then too. And there is no final answer, because forbidding it doesn't work. Not for adolescents, not for anybody. So in the end, we have to take responsibility for controlling the extent. There's going to be insults, horrible comedy, and it's going to be insightful, and it's going to be problematic.
Are you saying that about the midrashim or about Yishmael? Meaning, are you saying that Yishmael was trying to be comedic?
Yes, I mean, most of it is leitzanut, the clowning, sexual insinuations, just, making fun of him. He's really the child of everyone, all of it. It's insult comedy.
Interesting.
I don't think that's going to go away anytime soon.
So that is a good read, and as Nelson said, like, I think everyone's read is valid. I'm not sure that's what the Tosefta was saying. But it is a good insight, right? But I think the Tosefta was not making light of it that way. Like, I think they were actually thinking that Yishmael was.
They're thinking through, can this be gotten rid of? Can we have a society in which we just agree that this is out of bounds and no one should talk like this and it's just wrong and you're a bad character if you do? But you really can't. But I would say you can't. But at the end of the day, it's part of the human mission to control, to moderate, to not have that ruin your society. But I don't think it's part of the human capability to remove it. I don't.
That's interesting. I like that. So you're saying the Midrash is commenting on the boundary lines of sort of discourse, right? Like interaction, human interaction.
Maybe.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think Yishmael, he kind of goes away after this in a lot of ways, right? Esav sort of cycles in again, but Yishmael, with the exception of, one of my favorite images from next week's Parsha that is quiet, it's small, is that Yishmael and Yitzchak bury Abraham together. And there's nothing else in the text about it. That's all it says. It says that they come back to bury him. And I couldn't help but wonder, right, in the eyes of this midrash, if you imagine that it's those worst things, it's sort of shocking to imagine that Yitzchak allows Yishmael to come back and bury Abraham and that they do it together. And so I do sort of lean towards it being either something inheritance-wise or just sort of childish behavior, right? It makes me think about siblings who don't speak for decades but come back for funerals, right? There's something very poignant about that image. And I think that you lose that poignancy if you go the direction of the extremes. So I do think that there's something moderate about what's happening here, but that the Midrash often doesn't deal in moderation anyway. All right, this was such a great conversation. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you so much. Good night, guys.
And I hope to see you next week. Bye, guys. Have a good week and a Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Good Shabbos. Thank you.
Sure.